Again, welcome to today's training. Today is going to be another training on the performance measures. It will be the part 2 training to the one that we did in February, on February 17th, that was led by Claire on the performance measures progress report. So as you may recall, in that last performance measures training, we focused on how to read the budget to fill in the performance measures progress report. Specifically, we looked at the work plan, attachment C, and the budget itself, attachment B1. And today we are going to take a more in-depth look at specific questions on the performance measures, including the practice questions that many of you did. So that was questions 1 and 3. Thank you so much for your participation in that. We got a lot of responses, and it really just helps us help you more. We use the answers to inform our training. So thank you again. I'm just going to ask that we hold our questions to the end, or you can put them in the chat box during the training and we will come back to them at the end. Okay, before we dive right in, I'm going to just echo something that Claire said in our last training, which is that we need accurate data. So why do we need accurate data? Again, this information is used in the annual report that ILS sends to the Division of Budget on the status of implementation of the statewide reforms. So we use the data that you give us to advocate for continued funding. And of course, the idea being that continued funding leads to higher quality of legal representation. Essentially, we need to show that the money is being spent. Okay, so you may recognize this document. I sent it out on Monday when I sent out the reminder about this training. As you can see, it is a step-by-step guide to completing the performance measures. It's really about the process rather than specific content and too many details, but kind of an overarching flow of steps that you can take. Okay, so first step would be to gather your materials. I always recommend kind of having them right in front of you on hand. I like to print things out personally. So you're going to want to have these 4 documents on hand. One, of course, the performance measures progress report, the PDF version, which is available on our website. Then there is your county's statewide contract, which we went over in greater detail in our last training. You'll want to have a copy of that, specifically attachment B1 and C, and make sure that it is the most recent budget amendment. And then these next 2 documents are new. They were also sent out in the email reminder on Monday. Claire created this. It is a checklist for the performance measures, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It can be very useful to just simply check off the boxes of the materials you have that you need for filling out the report, and also as a reminder for the steps that you can take. Then there is the performance measures quick check, also created by Claire. I find this document very, very useful and user-friendly. Claire will go into more detail on that later on in the training. Okay, so using your printed out version, your PDF version, you're going to complete a draft of the performance measures. We ask that at this time you do not open the question pro link, that you save that for later. And so along with the instructions on the performance measures document itself, you can use ILS's supportive documents that I had just showed you, so the checklist and the quick check. Also, a reminder that you can always visit our website for all of these resources will be there. So those documents that I mentioned, plus the performance measures instructional video, FAQs, as well as the data officer best practices manual. And all of these materials are at our website, so ils.ny.gov, under the research and data analysis section, which I am quickly going to hopefully be able to show you. Okay. Can everyone see the web page right now? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Claire. I can just say Claire right now. So this is the home page. So you just go right here to research and data analysis, and your two best friends are going to be annual data reporting and data officers. So here's annual data reporting. You can see that it is organized by the reports. Scroll down here to the performance measures section, and all of the supportive materials are right here. In addition, under the data officer tab, you can see all of the past trainings, materials, the best practices manual, which, stay tuned, there will be an update soon. You'll be receiving an email about that as well. And then today's training materials are already up here under today's training, and shortly the recorded version of this video will be there as well. Okay. So now on to step 4, which is arguably one of the most important steps in this process, and that is to ensure the accuracy of the data that you're collecting. This is especially important given the web of people that are often involved in the data collection process. We know that each county and provider office tend to have a unique system for reporting, which a system that includes many people, chiefs, administrators, data officers, clerks, and more. So, for example, even if the data officer isn't sitting in your specific provider office, we strongly encourage you to loop them in on your data reporting process. You can use them as a resource. And conversely, if you yourself are a data officer and are the primary person, perhaps in your county, tasked with completing the report, the best practice is also to verify that data and obtain missing information from the defense providers in your county. So the key word here is collaborate. Okay, and so now that you have completed your draft of the performance measures, you've collaborated, you've ensured accuracy, then you can open up the Question Pro link. And as you all hopefully know, these links are sent out in advance via email. You all should have received yours by now, so please let us know if you have not. And then you can transfer the data from your PDF version of the report onto that Question Pro survey. And when you're complete, make sure that you click Done. Do not click Exit Survey, because that could lead to you losing your work and having to redo it, and we do not want that for you. This is a visual of what it should look like. When you're done, just go right there, and that's it. And then lastly is just to file your a copy of your performance measures progress report, so you have it for your records and for future reference. And that is all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Claire.
Great, thank you. All right, so now I will share my screen, and I can see okay, so it looks to me like we're good. Can everybody else see my screen? Great. Okay. So as Riley started us off, we're doing a more in-depth look at the performance measures, questions 1 and 3. And just because we feel so generous, we are also going to do a bonus bit on questions 5 and 6. So this presentation focuses on the performance measures, general instructions, and definitions. If you have your printed PDF of the performance measures, feel free to reference it. It could be helpful to look at it and follow along as we go through. And this is also essentially, as Riley mentioned, a discussion of the quick check sheet that was emailed out to you earlier and is available on the website. So if you have that printed out, you can follow along as well. A quick note, these documents that we have provided are meant to be supplementary to the definitions and instructions in the performance measures. And so if you ever have any questions or any or need to go back to the gold standard. That is the definitions in the performance measures. So I just wanted to say that really quick. And since we want to have plenty of time for questions at the end, I won't be going through the definitions line by line, which I'm sure you're all happy about. And so if I don't cover something and you do have a question on it, write it down and we'll get to it at the end. All right, so question 1. As this question tries to get a cumulative overview of attorney positions since the implementation of the statewide reforms, answers to this question should include all filled attorney positions that were funded through the contract on the last business day of the reporting period, i.e. March 31st, 2022. So what is this asking for? The total number of filled attorney positions paid by the statewide expansion of Hurl Herring contract and its amendments as of the last day of the reporting period. And one key thing to keep in mind is your reporting period here is from the start of statewide funding until the end of the current state fiscal year, because this question, as it says here in the definitions, is a cumulative overview. And so when we say cumulative, we mean positions starting in year 1 and every amendment thereafter, from April 1st, 2018 up until March 31st, 2022. So when you're filling out question 1, there are a number of steps that you need to go through. So for each position that you have, you're going to identify the type of position, attorney, supervisor, etc. Step 2, you're going to list the start date, and you'll want to pay attention to the definition of rehires in the instructions. Step 3, you're going to classify the position as a new hire, an upgrade of an existing hire, or on contract. Step 4, you'll mark whether the position provides CAFA coverage. And step 5, you'll list the number of cases this position is assigned. So you'll see that each of these steps coincides with each of these columns here. Each column is asking for a different piece of information. And so if you feel like you're repeating something, go back and review your instructions to make sure that you clearly understand the piece of information that particular column is asking for. And here is the definition of a rehire within the same position, but I know that Luchelli is going to go over that in more detail, so I will simply leave it up there for now. So I want to spend a little more time, as we did in part 1, talking about how to categorize your positions. So as you can see, this corresponds to step 3, where you determine whether your position is a new hire, an upgrade, or on contract. So of course, you want to start by looking at your budget. You may remember this from part 1, explaining that positions found in the personnel lines of the budget will be categorized as new hires or upgrades of existing hires, and positions in the contract consultant lines of the budget will be categorized as on contract. So if you haven't heard it enough, we'll say it again, use your budget. So there's one overarching principle that I want to start with, and that is that question 1 counts positions, not people. So when you're categorizing your positions for step 3, you're figuring out how the position appears in your budget. So a new hire refers to any new attorney position, part or full-time, that was filled on the last business day of the reporting period, i.e. March 31st, 2022, including but not limited to ACP attorney administrators and other ACP attorney staff. So in other words, a new hire is a position that did not exist prior to statewide funding and is filled as of the last business day of the reporting period. An upgrade of an existing hire refers to any attorney position that existed prior to the reporting period and for which the number of hours worked has increased as of the last business day of the reporting period, i.e. March 31st, 2022. So as we discussed at length in part 1, an upgrade of an existing hire is a position that existed prior to statewide funding, where statewide funding specifically increased the number of hours that position works. And of course, it has to be filled as of the last business day of the reporting period. So again, remember in part 1, as we discussed in part 1, to go back to your work plan to determine if you have an upgrade and confirm that you have that language in there stating that there is an increase in the number of hours worked. On contract refers to any individual attorney who occupies a position through a contract to provide services under this funding and who is working under that contract, you guessed it, on the last business day of the reporting period, i.e. March 31st, 2022. So on contract means that this position has a contract with the provider office. And of course, it's also filled. And again, you can go back to part one, the slides in part one, and use your work plan to determine whether your position counts as a position. On to question 3. As this question tries to get a cumulative overview of non-attorney positions since the implementation of the statewide reforms, answers to this question should include all filled non-attorney positions that were funded through the contract on the last business day of the reporting period, March 31st, 2022. So what is this asking for? The total number of filled non-attorney positions paid by the statewide expansion of Hurl Herring contract as of the last day of the reporting period. So the same in question 1. This question is cumulative. So we're asking for positions from the start of the statewide funding until the end of the current state fiscal year. So positions that start in year 1 and in any amendment thereafter. So question 3 actually only has 3 steps. Step 1, you have to identify the type of the position. Step 2, list the start date. And again, you want to pay attention to the definition of rehires in the instructions. And step 3, classify the position as a new hire, an upgrade of an existing hire, or on contract. Again, they coincide with the different columns that show up in the performance measures. And as in question 1, each of these columns is asking for different information. So we're going to go through it again, categorizing your position as it relates to question 3. So again, this is step 1 in filling out question 3 when you're categorizing the position as it appears in the budget for your non-attorney positions. So our lovely slide from part 1, where new hires or upgrades of existing hires are going to show up in your personnel lines, and your on-contract positions are going to show up in your contract consultant portion of the budget. So I won't read through this word by word again. Let's just go through it quickly. There is the same overarching principle. Question 3 counts positions, not people. So again, when you're categorizing a position for step 3, you're figuring out how that position shows up in your budget. Your new hires are positions that did not exist prior to statewide funding and were filled as of the last day of the reporting period. Your upgrades of an existing hire are positions that existed prior to statewide funding, where statewide funding increased the number of hours worked. Again, go to your work plan to find that language. And your contract positions are positions that have a contract with your provider office and are filled as of the last day of the reporting period. All right, so I know you were all just waiting eagerly to talk about questions 5 and 6. So here we go. Performance measure question 5 says, for the expenditures on investigative services listed in the contract, please estimate for the period between April 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022, and I'll combine them here, the total amount spent in US dollars for expert specialized services and investigative services. And so the general instructions here are very important. Question 5 asks to report how much of the contract funding was actually spent, bolded and underlined, towards contracted expert services and contracted investigative services between April 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022. So what is it asking for? They're asking for the dollar amount spent out of statewide expansion of Hurl Herring contract funding on retained expert services and retained investigative services, meaning that these positions, meaning that these experts and investigators were hired here on a contract basis. So your reporting period here changes. For the April report, which is obviously what we're doing now, you're going to look at the previous state fiscal year. So that's April 1st, 2021 until March 31st, 2022. For October, it's only the previous 6 months, from April until September. So who are your experts? Your expert services should include non-attorney professional services such as consulting and testifying experts, as well as interpreters, social workers, case managers, mitigation specialists, and other expert services. It does not include process servers, transcript services, or investigative services, which is asked about on a different question. So a note about investigators. They're generally easy to identify, but we want to take a minute to talk about the kinds of activities that investigators are doing that should be reported. So you'll note that this definition matches the ILS 195 definition. We are looking for investigators who assist defense counsel with factual investigations, including but not limited to identifying and interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence. We are not looking for investigators whose primary responsibility is process serving or whose primary responsibility is screening clients for financial eligibility. Again, it matches the ILS 195 definition, and there are a number of materials on that, so you can reference that for this particular piece. So what's the difference between question 3 and question 5? So question 3 is counting in-house positions, where the non-attorney staff position is either hired or contracted, because it can be one or the other, to work on the cases in the office. This, if you remember, is this is referencing the positions where the investigator is going to work on maybe not every single case that comes through the office, but the expectation is all of the cases or most of the cases. They're considered part of the staff. They come into the office regularly. They are, as referenced here, an in-house kind of position. And the difference then with question 5, I mean, 1 obviously is looking for dollars, but 2, question 5 focuses on contracted services where experts and investigators are retained on a case-by-case basis. And so if you remember from from the part 1, our second to last training, this slide here will help you determine which is which. So question 3 is looking for these positions, the 1 investigator per line, regular weekly commitment type of positions. Question 5, looking for example, if you're paying your investigators out of your non-attorney professional services line, or you're retaining them on a case-by-case basis, or you have an hourly rate. That's the difference. Question 6. Please estimate for the period between April 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022, the total number of cases in which, and I'll combine them, expert services and investigative services were used. Include all cases in which investigative services and expert services were provided as a result of contract funding made available to contract with investigators and contract funding made available to hire investigators as salaried employees. So what is it asking for? This is asking for the total number of cases in which an expert, any expert, was used and paid with a statewide expansion of Hurl Herring contract funding. And then B is the total number of cases in which an investigator, and this means any investigator, was used and paid with the statewide expansion of Hurl Herring contract funding. Again, the April report is the previous state fiscal year, so that's April 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2022. Your experts are the same definition as before. They include non-attorney professional services such as consulting and testifying experts, as well as interpreters, social workers, case managers, mitigation specialists, and other expert services. It does not include process servers or transcript services. And as before, we are looking for your investigators, the same way that we're looking for them in the ILS 195. You want to report your investigators that assist defense counsel with factual investigations, including but not limited to identifying and interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence, not process serving primarily, not screening clients for financial eligibility primarily. So what's the difference between question 5 and question 6? So question 5 is limited to statewide expansion contract funding spent on retained experts and investigators. The language that they use is contracted. And so that means those case-by-case positions. I'm sorry, those case-by-case experts and investigators. An expert is brought on one particular case, paid out of your non-attorney professional services line, and then their relationship with the office is done after that case. It does not include funding spent on hired positions. Question 6, on the other hand, in counting cases, includes cases where statewide expansion contract funding was used for a hired position, whether an expert or investigator, and also cases where funding was used to retain experts or investigators on a case-by-case basis. And so that's what I meant when I said before, any expert, any investigator. If your investigator was hired as a position that you reported in question 3, you want to count that in question 6. If your investigator was hired for one particular case and you paid them out of your NAPS line, and then they no longer have a relationship with the office after that case, as an example, you want to report that case in question 6. So to break it down a little bit more, question 6 asks for the number of cases where an investigator or expert was used, where that investigator and or expert was a hired position, in addition to the number of cases where an investigator or expert was used, where that investigator and or expert was retained on a case-by-case basis. All of those cases you're going to add together and report in question 6. So finally, use your budget knows, and your work plan when you fill out the performance measures progress report. They will be able to answer most of your questions, if not all of your questions, in terms of where you should report your positions and how you should categorize them. And that is it for me.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for that presentation. And let's see if I can share my screen. Can everybody see that or no? Sorry, okay, I can see Claire, okay. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Similarly to Claire, we're not going to be taking any questions until the end. I can see that some of you have already started putting them in the chat box. Thank you. So you can continue to do that if you have any while I'm presenting. So I'm going to be talking about common questions and errors that we have seen reported on the performance measures. If you see one of the questions that you've reached out to us to ask about, or if you see an error that someone from ILS has reached out to you about for clarification, don't feel bad. I think it means that you are in good company. It means that you're looking at the questions and you're taking the time to follow up to make sure that you're doing it right. And for the errors, a lot of them, we found that we think that some of them are just human error, and hopefully this will just kind of help you to kind of go through each of the questions a bit more carefully. So the first question that we get often is about rehires within the same position. I have an attorney position that was filled in May 2021, vacated in July 2021, then refilled in September 2021. How do I report that position? We have received this question quite a bit over the years, so much so that we included it in the instructions and definitions on the progress report. Like Claire said, remember the first thing you should always look to is the instructions and definitions when you are completing this report and have a question. A position that has been filled, vacated, then refilled is referred to as a rehire within the same position. And that is for question number 1 and question number 3. A rehire within the same position would only be counted once on your performance measures progress report. Why? Well, you have to take a look at the budget. As you can see on the example on this slide, there were 2 assistant public defender positions that were budgeted. If one of those assistant public defenders leaves, then someone refills the position. You wouldn't then say on your progress report that you have 3 assistant public defenders. You would say that you have 2. A 3rd position wasn't created because someone left. It's still just 2 positions based on what was budgeted. The next question that we get a lot is about classifying yourself or someone else as a new hire. I have been employed with the Public Defender's Office since 2019. Would I still be considered a new hire? If yes, why? The first thing that I would like everyone to know, and Claire briefly touched on this during her presentation, is that in question number 1 and question number 3, which asks you to report on filled positions, that is cumulative, which means that you're reporting filled attorney and non-attorney positions from when statewide implementation began on April 1st, 2018. And you're reporting on those positions through the last date of the reporting period. So for the purposes of this current April 22 report, for question number 1 and question number 3, you're reporting filled attorney and non-attorney positions from April 1st, 2018 through March 31st, 2022. Now, unless a position has a change in status, so for example, an increase in the number of hours worked and an increase in salary, which would make the position an upgrade, for the purposes of the performance measures progress report, that position will always be reported as a new hire. A new hire is always a new hire. One other thing I would like you to know in question number 1 in particular is there are 5 columns in question number 1. And the last column asks you to report on the total number of cases assigned to the attorney that you reported. Please note that the look-back period, the reporting period for that question is different than for the other 4 columns. The reporting period for question for number 5 is between April 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022. So for the first 4 columns in question number 1, you're going back to the beginning of statewide implementation in 2018. And for that last column, you're just focusing on the last year. These next 2 slides are about counsel at arraignment, which comes up in question number 1 and question number 2 on the progress report. If you have a statewide funded attorney who provides counsel at arraignment, you would report them in question number 1 and in question number 2. Look at your budget to determine if an attorney was hired to provide arraignment representation. As you can see at the top of this slide, you can see what it looks like in the budget. They will most likely appear under counsel at first appearance. As you can see, highlighted in blue, their salary and their fringe is in that box. You would report this position in question number 1 and say yes to indicate that they provide representation at arraignment. You would then report the total number of cases in the last column. Now, some of you may be asking yourselves, what about stipends, particularly for assigned counsel attorneys? This is also a common question. If an attorney gets paid a stipend for providing,
Sorry, I just saw a comment. We're actually also seeing your notes slides.
Oh no.
Is there a way to make it full screen? I think if you go to display settings and switch them, because you have 2 monitors, right?
Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing momentarily.
Sorry about that.
Let's see. Let's see. Uh-oh. Is that better? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go back to, this is now talking about stipends. If you have an attorney who gets paid a stipend for providing arraignment representation, how are they reported? And let's see, that is also a common question that we get. If an attorney gets paid a stipend, the first thing that you would do is you would look at your budget to determine if their stipends are funded by statewide expansion. It might look like this on your budget. So it might be under contract consultant and say after hours ACP stipends for conflict of interest cases. Since this position is in the budget for stipends, you would not report that position in question number 1. You would count up their arraignment cases, and if there's more than one attorney whose stipends are funded by the statewide expansion contract, you would then add up all of those attorneys' cases and report them in question number 2. For question number 2, you are adding any arraignment cases reported in the last column of question number 1 and all of the CAFA cases reported in question number 1 and any arraignment cases handled by attorneys not reported in question number 1 who are funded by the statewide contract. So one of our most common errors occurs for question 5 and question 6, and that is reporting that money has been spent on expert or investigative services, but leaving the second part of the question out, which asks for the total number of cases that the money was spent on. If you report that $5,000 was spent on investigative services, but do not report on any cases, someone from ILS will most likely reach out to you about why. What was the money spent on, if not cases? Please be sure to double check to make sure that you are completing each question accurately. Okay, this next question deals with investigators. If you hired a full-time investigator and are struggling to figure out where to include them, the first place to look is your budget. If the position is in the contract under contract consultant, as you can see on this slide, then they would be reported in question number 3. If you have an investigator that is retained on a case-by-case basis, they are most likely not an in-house position. So what would an investigator that is retained on a case-by-case basis look like in the budget? They would most likely be grouped together, as you can see on this slide, with other non-attorney professional services. So investigators, interpreters, social workers, psychiatrists, etc. That would most likely be an investigator that you would report in question number 5. Things to remember. As you complete this report, I think we focus a lot on questions number 1 through question number 6. And then there's a qualitative section of the report at the end, questions number 7 through 11. And a lot of times that section of the report is left blank. We strongly encourage you to go through and complete those questions. Please clarify and further explain any information that you can think of from previous questions in question number 11. Question number 11 is the catch-all question of this report. If you reported an attorney on a previous report or you have something that you want to expand on from one of the questions, in question number 11, you can say, for question number 2, this is the reason why I reported X, Y, and Z. You can put that information in question number 11. It really assists us as we go through after you submit your report in analyzing your data. The second thing to remember is to use the materials in the Data Officer's Best Practices Manual to supplement the instructions and definitions. As Riley showed during her presentation, all of that information is on our website. We've also sent it to you via email. It's very important to kind of look through all of these documents to help you better understand any of the questions. Third, please review previous data officer trainings for additional information. When we send out the video for this training, we'll also be sending out form that has some timestamps so that you can look at certain questions of when we talked about them during these data officer trainings. Fourth, please review your progress reports prior to submission to ensure that accurate data is reported. You know, as we've talked about a lot, we're really trying to focus in on making sure that the data that you're reporting is accurate and the data that, of course, we are submitting to the Division of Budget is accurate. So please just, if you could, when you're collaborating with your chief or ACP administrator, take a look at the report before you go ahead and hit that done button to submit it to us. And lastly, there will be no extensions to this progress report. The April 30th, 2022 reporting deadline is final. And the reason for this, we've spoken about it previously, is that we have a very, very small window to analyze all of your data and write a report that we submit to the Division of Budget at the end of May. So we have 1 month to take all of the statewide reports, analyze the data, and then create a report of our own to submit to the Division of Budget. So with that said, you know, some of you have already started to submit your progress reports. Thank you so much. We've started to get those in. But I very, very encourage all of you, please, to start working on your reports and try to get those into us as soon as possible because the April 30th, 2022 deadline is a hard deadline for this report. Questions? I'm going to see if I can get out of stop sharing.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys want to start with, we had some questions in the chat that came up. So maybe we can start there. And then if anybody has additional questions, type them in the chat, call out, raise your hand if you know how to work that part of WebEx, etc. Okay, question 1. I had an attorney that was part-time but was not paid via statewide funding. He was moved to full-time and is now paid via statewide funding. Would this be a new hire or an upgrade? So I actually, Heather, have a, either unless Riley or Lucelli, you want to take this, my follow-up question would be, is statewide paying for a portion of the salary, the portion being the increase from full-time, increase from part-time to full-time? If ILS is paying for that increase, that is an upgrade. That is the definition, most certainly, of an upgrade, an increase in hours, part-time to full-time, paid by statewide expansion funding. Okay, if we're good on that, question 2. If a funded attorney or funded non-attorney position separates prior to 3/31, they will not be reported in question 1 or in question 3, correct? Correct. That was easy. The position has to be filled as of the last day of the reporting period. And so if the position is not filled, it would not go on the performance measures. But I will also say that this is where question 11 is very, very important, because this is a prime example of an opportunity for the data officer or whoever it is filling out the performance measures to say, hey, guess what, ILS, I have all of these positions in my budget, but they are not filled. And so therefore they are not reported in the performance measures. So please use question 11 to explain any of those types of details. We would very much appreciate it. All right, question 3, starting date. The chief attorney started with the firm in 2004, however, he was promoted to chief in 2014. Which date does one use? So this also will require some follow-up questions. because it will depend on how it shows up in the budget and what ILS is paying for. And so I might actually come back to that one because I think we would need to get detailed, unless Luchelli or Riley, you have any comments on that one.
No, yeah, I would say we might want to parking lot this one and come back to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Beth, hold us to that. Don't let us forget. All right, next question. When someone replaces the existing position, does one use the new person's hire date or the existing person you replaced? So this is our rehire issue. And actually, if you guys don't mind, what I'm going to do, if I can find it, is go back to this. So rehire within the same position. If a position was filled by an individual, the individual left, and another individual was hired, i.e. a rehire within the same position, please count this as one hire and only report the starting date for the first individual. So just the start date for the first one. All right. So does anybody else have any questions? Okay. And also, there is just one other note that I wanted to make, and that is that if a position predates the statewide contract itself, and that obviously means prior to April 1st, 2018, then actually I'm going to hold off on explaining that a little bit more and go back to the questions that we had. Luchelli, do you want to go take us back to that, the question from Beth?
The chief attorney started with the firm in 2004. However, he was promoted to chief in 2014. Which date does one use? So I do think with this one that we would have to go back to the budget because the chief, I'm assuming that promotion is covered by statewide. Beth? Back. Beth?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Part of his salary is covered by the ILS report budget.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Part of his salary is covered, not his full salary. So it's partial. So it's almost like part-time, but he's a full-time attorney. He's the chief, but only part of his salary is covered by this budget.
Okay.
And he's been chief since 2014, so I would assume, I don't know.
Well,
As far as the starting.
let's ask,
so
how does that money show up in the budget?
Supervising trial attorney, part-time to full-time, and then it gives a dollar amount.
Okay, so that part-time to full-time, what I would say is go back to your work plan, make sure that that salary, that money in your contract is because the position is transitioning from a part-time to a full-time position. And that would be, it sounds to me at least, like that would be an upgrade.
That wasn't my question. My question is, what date am I using as his start date? Am I using his start date when he started with the firm, or am I using his start date and when he became chief? That's my question.
That, I would say use the start date for
Yeah,
when
that's what I'm gonna use.
he's
That's what I put on
funding, when he's
ILS.
funding, yeah.
The ILS I-95, I put in his start date, which was 2004.
So I would put in the start date for when he began to be funded partially by the statewide contract. So the ILS 195,
Okay.
yeah, and so the reason why I say that is because the ILS 195 covers all of the different funding streams that a provider office receives. So it could cover, grants, the statewide funding, anything else that you're getting from the county. But this performance measures report only covers positions that are funded by the statewide contract, right?
Great.
And so I would include the date that he began to be funded by the statewide, or the year that he began to be funded by the statewide expansion contract. And then I would also, if you want, you can also put in question number 11, further explanation for why you're using that date.
Okay.
And this kind of goes back to the overarching concept of counting positions as they appear in the budget rather than people. So your person, your chief defender started in 2014, I think, right? But the statewide contract, itself didn't start until April 1st, 2018. And so what we're looking for is the date that the funding showed up in your budget. So technically a shortcut is it can't be before April 1st, 2018. That is literally the earliest day that you can report in the performance measures. And so that might actually be a good way to check whether you're reporting the correct date, is if you have a date that you think you should report, but it is before April 1st, 2018, look at it again, check and see how it shows up in your budget, where it shows up in your budget, and report that date.
So that would follow suit for everyone, not just him.
Yeah.
So, even though it says starting date, doesn't mean the starting date when they were hired. This is very confusing. Need clarification on that. It really,
yeah, and I know that
starting date of the grant.
Yeah.
Very confusing.
Here's the best way that I have found to conceptualize it, big picture. The performance measures is asking, how are you spending our money? And so since we're asking, how are you spending our money through the statewide expansion contract, those dates that you're reporting can't predate you getting the money, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense to me when I talk to you, but when you read it, it doesn't make sense.
That's completely understandable. And I know that especially because you also fill out the ILS 195, which you report on whichever date they started. So it could be 2004, that it gets a little confusing when you switch very closely, because you're reporting on the ILS 195, you report that to us April 1st, and then the performance measures is April 30th. And so there is a bit of confusion sometimes, which is why we separate out the trainings. But like Claire said, just think of the performance measures as a tiny piece of a pie. Performance measures is very, very specific to the statewide contract. And then the ILS 195 is everything else. So when you think of the performance measures, don't think about anything before April 1st, 2018. It's just a little teeny tiny piece of the pie, and kind of just focus in on that very, very specific information that we're asking for.
Got it. Thank you. I mean, I am brand new. I started in January, and Riley has been my right-hand lady. I had no idea what I'm doing, but I got through it.
Yes, and we're always here, of course. You can email the performance inbox, performance@ils.ny.gov. You can always give us a call, and we can get back to you, of course. So I see we have another question. If an attorney was here prior to the grant, we would use 4/1/18 as their start date, correct? If their funding, they started to be funded by the statewide contract, then yes, As of 4/1/18, if they started to receive funding through the contract, then yes, they would use that start date. And then Heather, you asked if a person was hired after the position was created. Do we use the position creation date or the date the position was filled? You would use the date the position was filled, because we're asking for, we want to make sure the person is sitting at their desk. They're there and they're present. Other questions? Yeah, so when the funding began to be used, exactly. And that's why we say also, you know, Claire referenced this, to always go back to your budget, and then Riley also referenced to make sure that you're looking at all the amendments to the budget to make sure that you're seeing those exact dates from when funding began, because it's not always in year 1, it could have happened in year 2 or year 3, or, you know, as now year 4, going forward year 5. Are there more questions? I feel like there are. We can stay on for a few minutes if anyone has any questions that they want to ask.
I do. Again, it's Beth again. In question number 1, when it says enter the total number of cases assigned, I'm under the assumption that is the total number of new cases assigned during that time frame.
Yes, I want to say yes, but I'm going to also defer to my colleagues. New cases, correct, Claire?
New cases or new and existing, because they do both.
So just one second. I'm a visual person.
Ditto.
So you're talking about step 5 here. What was the total number of cases assigned to this attorney between April 1st, 2021 and March 31st, 2022? Is that your question?
Well, that's also that, but no, in question number 1, it asked enter the total number. Yes. Yes, I am.
Okay, and your question is, does that total encompass both newly assigned cases as well as, for example, inherited cases?
Or cases that are ongoing.
I'm not sure we've discussed. Yes,
Great.
Melissa.
This is Melissa. And I was always under the assumption that we were talking about new case assignments during that period,
Okay.
and that the new cases language aligns with the ILS 195. We're looking at new cases assigned. But this is something we should discuss internally and get back to you, but that was always my assumption, though I wasn't involved in the creation of the form, and so we'll have to go back and see if we can find those documents and see, but I was always under the assumption it was new cases assigned during that period of time.
Well, I think what we can do maybe is call this the end of the training. If anybody does have additional questions and wants to email or stay on, but in terms of the official, and Luchelli Riley, feel free to chime in, but in terms of the official training, I think that we can say thank you very much for joining us, and go get accurate data.